When medieval women are mentioned in history, the narrative usually falls into two familiar paths. One emphasizes restriction and injustice, portraying women as figures excluded from power. The other romanticizes them as symbols of sacrifice and endurance. This video follows neither approach. Instead of asking what medieval women were allowed or forbidden to do, we pose a different question, one more concrete and harder to avoid. What did medieval women actually do day after day to keep their families alive? Not in great historical moments, but in the rhythms of ordinary life, where food had to be maintained, bodies had to be cared for, labor had to continue, and no system existed to absorb mistakes. To answer this question, we need to look at medieval life from the inside out, not through large structures of power, but through the household, where survival was decided by repeated quiet actions that were rarely written down. When modern people speak of family, they often imagine a private space, separated from economics, politics, and survival. The family is seen as a place of rest after work, a site where society's products are consumed, and where emotional life is cultivated. In medieval society, this concept does not exist. The family is not separate from the world. The family is the world. For most of Europe's medieval population, especially peasants and artisans, the household functions as a single unit of production, care, education, and protection, all combined into one structure. There's no boundary between private life and social life. There's no idea of going to work and then returning home. Everything happens simultaneously in the same space, carried out by the same people. And within this structure, women are not helpers. They are the central axis of operation. This does not arise from ideology, nor from a medieval society that somehow valued women more. In fact, legal and religious texts of the period often restrict women's formal roles. But survival does not wait for legal recognition. It takes shape from necessity. To understand why women occupy this position, one must confront a fundamental reality. Medieval society lacks intermediary systems. There is no stable food supply chain, no universal healthcare system, no public education, no social welfare. Everything a family possesses, food, health, skills, the ability to sustain the next generation, must be created and maintained within the household itself. In this context, women become primarily responsible not because they are naturally suited to these roles by gender norms, but because they are the most continuously present figures in the family's survival cycle. Bearing children, raising them, caring for the sick, preparing food, managing resources. What must be emphasized is this: these roles are not symbolic, they are operational. If bread is not made properly, the family goes hungry. If food is not preserved through winter, the family faces scarcity. If early signs of illness are ignored, a loved one may not survive. There is no plan B. In modern society, when an individual fails in a role, the system often absorbs the risk. Food can be bought elsewhere, a doctor can be consulted, support services can be called. In medieval society, the family is the final point where all risk comes to rest. For this reason, medieval women do not live in a state of choice. They live in a state of continuous response to survival needs. From a young age, girls are drawn into this cycle, not through formal instruction, but through observation and direct participation. They learn to make bread not to help, but to ensure that a vital skill is passed on. They learned to recognize illness not to cure it in a modern sense, but to avoid missing the moment when action still matters. This produces a particular kind of knowledge. Knowledge that is unwritten, unstandardized, but tested repeatedly through real consequences. A correct decision allows a family to survive the winter. A wrong decision may mean a child does not live to see spring. Here, a common misunderstanding must be avoided. The idea that medieval women endured more than modern women. In reality, they had no comparative frame. This is not sacrifice understood as a moral choice, but a condition of existence. A medieval family does not ask, "Who should do this?" It asks, "What happens if this is not done?" And very often, the answer points toward women. In medieval life, no one sat down to assign responsibility for feeding the household. The role was not granted, formally recognized, or openly debated. It emerged quietly, shaped by a simple fact. Who was forced to confront the consequences first when food began to run short? In most ordinary households, that person was a woman. Not because women controlled land or large supplies. On the contrary, they held almost no formal rights over such resources. But they occupied the spaces where food became life itself. The hearth, the storage area, the meals that grew smaller as the seasons progressed. Their responsibility did not begin with cooking, but with recognizing the moment when concern had to begin. When stored supplies were no longer as full as in previous years. When grain prices at the market rose before any public crisis was declared. When bread had to be mixed with lower quality ingredients to stretch the remaining flour. These changes were subtle, but women were the ones who saw them every day. In medieval society, where most law concerned land, taxation, and obligations to lords, the household food economy existed largely outside legal texts. That very invisibility placed full responsibility in women's hands, without any mechanism for sharing or offsetting the burden. They did not prepare food only for the present. They adjusted the rhythm of the entire household according to what remained. Portions changed not because hunger was immediate, but because future hunger was anticipated. A smaller meal today could mean several more days of survival later. Such decisions were not made once. They were repeated, quietly, every day. It is important to understand that women were not merely conserving resources. They were assessing risk. Keeping food that had begun to spoil might allow the family to eat for one more day, but it could also leave everyone dangerously ill. Discarding it was a cruel decision in times of scarcity, yet sometimes the only way to preserve the household's ability to work. These choices were not based on medical theory, but on experience accumulated through consequences. Who fell ill after eating what? Which foods weakened small children? Which kinds of bread the elderly could not digest? This knowledge was never written down, but it was remembered for a long time. Women also distributed food according to priority, a task that was never simple. Children needed to eat to grow. Adults needed food to work. The sick needed nourishment to recover. Yet there was never enough for everyone at once. There were no perfect choices, only choices that allowed the family to last a little longer. In scattered records from manorial accounts and urban regulations, when poor quality bread caused illness, responsibility was often assigned to the baker. Within the household, that baker was almost always a woman. This suggests that medieval society, while denying women formal authority, implicitly recognized who bore final responsibility. This responsibility was one-directional. Women could not decide the harvest, yet they carried the consequences when the harvest failed. They did not control prices, yet they were forced to manage when prices rose. They could not change the system, but they were the ones who collided most directly with its breakdown. Beyond the household, women also maintained unnamed networks of mutual support with other women, sharing food, exchanging knowledge, offering temporary help when a household fell into crisis. These connections rarely appear in historical records, yet they softened the severity of hunger. When food became scarce on a wider scale, women were often the first to react, not as political actors, but as people who could no longer make things work in the kitchen. When every option within the household was exhausted, public action became an extension of private responsibility. From the outside, it may be tempting to label this a traditional role. But in the medieval context, it is a position created by survival realities, not by belief or moral norms. Women did not hold power in the formal sense, yet they stood at the intersection of food, time, and survival. From that position, they kept households going in a world where mistakes left no opportunity for correction. From the responsibility of feeding the family, their role naturally expanded into the preservation of health, childbirth, and care of the human body. Domains where the boundary between life and death was even more fragile than hunger itself, and where the presence of women once again became irreplaceable. When food has been stretched to its final limits, the next threat a medieval household faces no longer comes from the storehouse, but from the bodies of the people within it. Illness does not appear as a rare event. It is a constant, quiet presence, indifferent to age. A fever, a small wound, a child with prolonged diarrhea, any one of these can disrupt the entire rhythm of family life. And once again, the first person required to respond is not a physician or a priest, but the woman of the household. For most of the Middle Ages, professional medicine exists primarily in religious institutions or large towns. For the vast majority of people living in scattered rural settlements, access to trained healers is not only difficult, but costly. As a result, healthcare becomes a natural extension of household life, rather than a separate domain. Medieval women are not formally trained in medicine, but they accumulate a different kind of knowledge. Knowledge shaped by repetition, illness, and consequence. They know which fevers usually pass and which turn dangerous. They can distinguish wounds that will heal from those showing signs of infection. They recognize when a child is merely tired and when that fatigue signals something more serious. These judgments are not based on theory, but on memory. Who did not survive? Who did? And what was done in each case? In a world without antibiotics or infection control, the decision of whether to intervene can matter more than the method itself. Women must weigh letting the body recover on its own against using experiential remedies, herbs, compresses, dietary changes, each of which carries its own risks. These decisions are rarely witnessed by outsiders, yet they shape survival rates across generations. This role becomes most visible in childbirth. For medieval women, pregnancy and birth are not separate phases removed from daily life. They unfold alongside labor, household care, and the food responsibilities already described. Pregnant women continue working until their bodies no longer allow it. not because they underestimate the danger, but because no one else can replace them in the daily chain of survival. Birth takes place in familiar spaces, supported by other women. The midwife is not a figure of authority, but a holder of experiential knowledge. She does not control the process, but observes and intervenes when necessary. Most of the time, childbirth is a form of managed surrender, accepting risk while attempting to reduce it within narrow limits. Notably, responsibility does not diminish after birth. Women return quickly to their former rhythm, because the household cannot pause. Newborns require constant care, but older children, the elderly, and the sick cannot be set aside. Here, caregiving is not an expression of tenderness, but a survival function. The woman is the one who keeps the bodies of family members from slipping beyond the threshold of recovery. In scattered monastic and ecclesiastical records, when medical practices deemed unorthodox are mentioned, women are often the subjects. This reflects not only clerical suspicion, but also reveals who is actually intervening in health at the most fundamental social level. Women do not have the authority to define what counts as legitimate medicine, but they decide whether a practice continues to be used based on whether it helps someone survive. Over time, what works is retained, what fails is abandoned. Knowledge is filtered not through books, but through outcomes. As with food, healthcare within the household is not equal. Priorities always exist. Who is treated first? Who receives the scarce herbs? Who is allowed more rest? These decisions are rarely spoken aloud, but they follow a stark logic of survival. Women do not only care for the bodies of others, they often place their own bodies last. Prolonged labor, repeated childbirth, and chronic undernourishment erode their health over time. Yet because they are the operational center of the household, this deterioration is often concealed until it can no longer be ignored. From a modern perspective, it is easy to see these roles as unjust burdens. But in medieval society, this is not framed as a moral issue. It is the way families survive in the absence of external support systems. Women do not hold sweeping authority, yet they stand repeatedly before small decisions whose consequences are anything but small. Keeping someone alive for another day, helping a child survive an illness, choosing between intervention and restraint. From sustaining the family through food, their role extends into sustaining life in its most direct sense. And when this entire chain is viewed as a continuum, from nourishment to health to childbirth, it becomes clear that the role of medieval women is not a collection of separate tasks. It is a continuous position, one in which they stand between the household and threats that never fully disappear. After food has been stretched so it does not fully run out, and bodies have been held on the survivable side of the line between life and death, a medieval household still cannot be considered stable. Existence becomes sustainable only when the family can reproduce itself, not only biologically, but in skills, labor, and economic capacity. And at the deepest level of this process, once again, women occupy the central position. In medieval society, very few forms of work are officially named. Labor that carries a name is usually tied to obligations, taxes, or contracts. Everything else, the majority of lived time, takes place outside written record. It is within this unwritten space that women's labor exists almost entirely. Textile work is the clearest example. Clothing is not a consumer good that can be purchased when needed. Cloth is an asset, a form of bodily protection, a marker of status, and sometimes a medium of exchange. From spinning fiber to weaving, from mending to reusing worn fabric, women are responsible for the entire life cycle of textiles. This work is not seasonal. It fills the invisible intervals of time. Evenings, winters, moments of waiting, hours spent watching children. Precisely because it runs alongside all other activities, textile production is rarely recognized as an independent occupation, even though its economic value is entirely real. In many households, woven goods do not serve only internal needs. They are exchanged, paid as rent in kind, or sold in local markets. Yet even when this labor enters the monetary economy, it is rarely recorded under women's names. It dissolves into the vague category of the household economy. Alongside textile work, care labor is another form of work that is almost completely invisible. Caring for children, the elderly, and the sick is not considered productive. Yet without it, no other labor can take place. Women keep alive those who do not directly generate economic value, and it is precisely this that allows the household to continue functioning as a unit. Care, in this context, is not primarily emotional. It is a concrete allocation of time and energy. Who needs to be watched closely? Who can be left to manage alone? Who must be protected from heavy labor? These decisions directly shape the household's ability to reproduce its labor power over the long term. Most importantly, women are the transmitters of skill. In a society where formal education barely exists for the lower classes, practical knowledge is passed on through observation and repetition. How to bake bread, how to preserve food, how to treat minor illness, how to mend clothing, how to negotiate small exchanges. All of this is learned within the household, most often from mother to daughter, from older women to younger ones. This knowledge is not standardized, but it is highly adaptive. It shifts by region, climate, and economic condition. And precisely because it is not fixed in texts, it can respond quickly to change. Crop failure, disease, shifts in taxation. Here, women are not only maintaining the present household, they are preparing the future one, ensuring that the next generation possesses the skills needed to survive in the same harsh world. When examining medieval household economies, it is easy to overlook these contributions because they do not appear in account books. But if women's labor is removed, the household economy collapses immediately. Without clothing, without care, without skill transmission, men's official labor cannot be sustained. The paradox is this: because women's labor is so deeply embedded in everyday life, it becomes invisible. It is not named because it is always there. And when something is always there, society stops seeing it. Yet in moments of crisis, crop failure, war, epidemic, this role suddenly becomes visible. When men are absent or no longer able to work, women do not merely maintain the household, they take on its remaining economic functions as well. They expand craft production, intensify small-scale exchange, and draw on every available skill to prevent the household from breaking apart. It is no accident that in many crisis records, women appear described as those who manage, endure, or hold the household together. These words are vague, but behind them lies a concrete reality. Women are the ones who prevent the household economy from collapsing when larger structures become fragile. Their unnamed labor does not produce prosperity. It produces continuity. And in a society where the boundary between existence and disappearance is always thin, that capacity for continuity is the highest value a household can achieve. When the family is no longer seen as an isolated unit, but as part of a small community in which people depend on one another to survive, a different kind of order becomes visible. This order is not written into law, not enforced through violence, and has no clearly defined leader. It exists through repeated relationships, unspoken obligations, and behaviors that are expected but rarely articulated. Within this order, women occupy a distinctive position, not because they are granted authority over the community, but because they are the ones who connect households to one another. They meet in spaces that are informal by nature. At the well, the communal oven, small markets, religious gatherings, or at moments of birth, illness, and death. It is in these spaces that information circulates, assistance takes shape, and tensions are either eased or ignited. These connections are not random. They are sustained through repetition and social memory. Who helped during childbirth? Who shared food during a lean season? Who can be trusted with a child, and who cannot? Such judgments require no formal declaration, yet they shape how the community responds when crisis emerges. Because women are closely tied to the everyday survival of households, they are often the first to sense when this micro-level order begins to fracture. When a family no longer has enough to eat, when children begin to fall ill more frequently, when the elderly are neglected. These signs do not appear in account books or court records. They appear in daily life, and women are the first to notice them. From there, informal responses are activated. Temporary sharing, short-term assistance, or, in more serious cases, collective pressure placed on those seen as disrupting balance. Speculators, dishonest bakers, or households perceived as failing in their communal obligations. It is important to note that women do not act as arbiters in the sense of abstract fairness. Micro-social order is not based on idealized justice, but on the capacity to maintain stability. Whoever threatens that stability becomes a target of response, whether their actions are formally legal or not. For this reason, in many small disturbances of medieval life, market disputes, conflicts over bread prices, tensions between households, women frequently appear as drivers of collective action, not because they seek social change, but because prolonged instability is not something they can allow. This role is also clearly visible in communal rituals. Births, marriages, and funerals are not merely personal events, but mechanisms for reaffirming order. Women organize, sustain, and transmit these rituals, ensuring that individuals remain bound to the social network. Who is included, who is excluded, who receives greater support. Each carries clear social meaning, even when never spoken aloud. At this level, women do not require formal power to shape communal behavior. They do so through presence, through unwritten speech, and through the ability to mobilize or withdraw support. In a society without welfare systems, such support determines whether a household endures or is pushed to the margins. Notably, this micro-level order does not directly oppose the formal power of the Church or the Lord. It exists alongside it, filling gaps where larger authorities cannot or choose not to intervene. When official systems function smoothly, this order is almost invisible. But when those systems weaken during famine, epidemic, or war, It becomes the final line of defense. And within that line of defense, women are not commanders. They are the binding agent. No chronicle records their names. No text describes them as keepers of order. Yet through small, repeated, and seemingly ordinary actions, medieval communities avoid complete disintegration in moments when no other force is close enough to intervene. When viewed across the full sequence of roles, from feeding the household to caring for bodies, sustaining the household economy, and maintaining communal balance, it becomes clear that medieval women do not stand outside social structure. They stand within it, at its lowest but most resilient level. And from that level, fragile and imperfect though it is, social order continues to endure across centuries. When viewed from the present, it is easy to fall into two familiar extremes. One is to see medieval women as victims of an unjust society. The other is to romanticize them as symbols of endurance and sacrifice. Both perspectives miss what matters most. The fundamental difference between medieval women and modern women does not lie in human nature, but in the systems they live within. Medieval women lived in a world where survival was direct, concrete, and impossible to postpone. Every decision carried consequences that followed almost immediately. If food ran out, the family went hungry. If illness was not addressed, a loved one might not survive. If skills were not passed on, the next generation became weaker than the one before. Modern women, in most industrialized societies, live in a world where survival has been mediated. Food comes through supply chains, healthcare through professional systems, education through schools, welfare through the state or the market. Risk has not disappeared, but it has been dispersed and delayed. This creates a fundamental difference in role. Medieval women carried survival risk directly. Modern women coordinate risk through systems. In medieval life, there was no concept of work-life balance. Work was the condition that allowed life to continue. Women had no option to withdraw from their roles because no structure existed to replace them if they disappeared. In modern life, women can, at least in theory, separate personal roles from survival roles. Leaving a job does not mean immediate hunger. Illness does not mean instant death. Mistakes do not always lead to irreversible consequences, but this shift comes with a paradox. When systems absorb most risk, the link between action and consequence becomes blurred. Modern women have more choices, but often find it harder to see the long-term impact of those choices on family and community structures. Medieval women did not need a cultivated sense of responsibility. Responsibility was self-evident because consequences were always visible. Modern women often have to actively construct that sense in a world where consequences are delayed, hidden, or carried by others. Yet one thing has not changed. In both eras, women remain the ones who prevent everyday life from collapsing. The form has changed, but the function remains. Today, instead of allocating food portions, they allocate time. Instead of guarding food stores, they maintain daily rhythms. Instead of transmitting survival skills directly, they guide adaptive skills. The work is no longer immediately life or death, but it remains foundational. When modern women withdraw entirely from these coordinating roles, families and communities do not collapse at once. Instead, fractures appear gradually, tension accumulates, connections loosen, and a sense of instability spreads. Another crucial difference lies in visibility. Modern women can name their roles through language, law, and social discourse. Medieval women could not. Their roles were unnamed, yet assumed to always exist. And because they were unnamed, they were difficult to challenge. No one debated who would feed the family when winter came. The question was never asked. Today, the question is asked, and that is a major advance. But asking it brings a new responsibility, understanding what happens if no one takes on that role at all. The final issue is power. Medieval women held no formal power, but they possessed structural influence. If they stopped, the system collapsed quickly. Modern women hold more legally defined power, but their structural influence is often diffused into larger systems, making it harder to recognize. No era is ideal. No role is perfect. But when the two are placed side by side, one thing becomes clear. Medieval women did not live in a more unjust world because they were weaker. They lived in a world with fewer buffers. Modern women do not live in a better world because all problems have been solved. They live in a more complex one, where responsibility is fragmented, dispersed, and sometimes invisible. When we look back across this entire trajectory, from family to food, to the body, to unnamed labor, to community, what remains is not a moral lesson, but an awareness that human survival in any era depends on repeated, quiet, and often unrecognized actions. And for much of history, those actions were carried out by women, not as symbols, but as the conditions that allowed the world to keep functioning. This is not a story of a distant past. It is the foundation upon which the present still stands. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking the time to slow down and reflect on a part of history that is often passed over too quickly. If the questions raised in this video have led you to see family life, everyday roles, or the ways life is sustained through small, quiet actions in a different light, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you would like to continue conversations like this, where history is told not through grand events, but through human lives, you can subscribe to the channel to follow future videos. We truly appreciate your presence here.